The route that never ends. Lucy had been driving for Uber for a year now. She loved the flexibility of the job and the interesting people she met, until one Friday night when everything changed. The request came in at 11:30 p.m. from a trendy downtown nightclub. Lucy accepted and arrived to find a tall man in a black hoodie standing under a flickering streetlight. "Marcus?" she asked as he approached. He nodded, climbing into the back seat without a word. He didn't seem drunk, which was a relief, but his silence was unnerving. Lucy checked the destination, a residential area she didn't recognize. The route was oddly complicated, weaving through lesser-used streets and back roads. As they drove, Lucy noticed something strange. The GPS kept rerouting her, recalculating the directions every few minutes. She double-checked the address Marcus had entered, but it didn't seem to match any known location. She tried to make conversation to ease her growing unease. "So, do you live in the area?" No response. Marcus stared straight ahead, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the car. About 20 minutes into the ride, Lucy realized they had passed the same street 3 times. Her heart began to race as a sense of dread crept over her. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with the GPS. Do you know a better route?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his breath fogging the rearview mirror. "Just keep driving," he said softly. Lucy's grip on the wheel tightened. She decided to pull over and reset her GPS manually. But when she stopped the car and turned around to speak to Marcus, he was gone. The door hadn't opened, and there was no sign of him anywhere. Panic surged through her. She frantically looked around, but the street was deserted. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from the Uber app. "Your ride is not complete. Keep driving." Terrified, Lucy restarted the car and tried to retrace her steps, but the streets seemed to twist and shift. It was as if the city was rearranging itself around her. She drove for what felt like hours, the world outside growing darker and more unfamiliar. Finally, she emerged onto a road she recognized, her apartment complex in sight. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror, Marcus was there, staring at her with glowing eyes. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said. Story 1. The Silent Passenger. It was nearing midnight when Noah, a part-time Uber driver, decided to take one last ride for the night. The notification pinged, and the request was from a location deep in the outskirts of town. The map showed a pin dropped at the edge of a dense forest. The rider's name was simply listed as Sarah. Despite his exhaustion, Noah drove to the pickup point. As he pulled up, he squinted into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a pale woman wearing a long coat drenched from the drizzle. Her face was obscured by the hood, and her movements were unnervingly silent. "Sarah?" Noah asked, rolling down his window slightly. She nodded without a word and got into the back seat. Her destination? An old, abandoned hospital on the other side of town. Noah shuddered, but didn't comment. He started the trip, glancing occasionally at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The ride was uneventful at first, aside from the strange silence that hung heavy in the air. Noah tried making small talk. "So, are you meeting someone there?" No response. He tried again. "Long day, huh?" Then he heard it, a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was static from the radio, but it wasn't even turned on. He fiddled with the knob to confirm. Silence. Yet the whispering persisted, soft and unintelligible, like it was coming from behind him. He glanced in the mirror again, and for a split second, he thought he saw her lips moving. But her reflection didn't quite match her physical movements in the back seat. The whispers grew louder. "Stop," she finally said, her voice low and raspy. Noah hit the brakes, confused and unsettled. They were still miles from the hospital. "Is everything okay?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a narrow dirt road leading off the main highway. Against his better judgment, he followed her direction, the car's headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. When they reached the end of the dirt road, the hospital loomed before them, its windows shattered and its walls blackened by time. Noah's heart raced. "Are you sure this is the place?" "This is where I died," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the car. Noah whipped around, but the back seat was empty. The door creaked open on its own, and the scent of decayed flowers wafted into the car. Terrified, he sped off, his tires screeching against the gravel. He didn't stop until he was safely home. When he checked his Uber app, there was no record of the ride. Later, out of curiosity, he searched the hospital's history. Decades ago, it had burned down in a fire, killing several patients. Among them was a woman named Sarah, who had been trying to escape. Story 3. The Forgotten Passenger. Daniel loved being an Uber driver. It gave him the chance to explore his city and meet all kinds of people. But one rainy evening, he picked up a passenger who would haunt him forever. The request came from a cemetery on the edge of town. Daniel hesitated. Who requests a ride from a graveyard? But ultimately decided to accept. When he arrived, an elderly woman was waiting by the gate, holding a small bouquet of lilies. She wore an old-fashioned dress and a kind smile. "Thank you, young man," she said as she got into the back seat. Her destination was an address Daniel didn't recognize, but he started the trip without question. The woman, who introduced herself as Miriam, began to talk about her late husband. Her stories were vivid and heartfelt, and Daniel found himself captivated. As they drove, the atmosphere in the car grew heavy. The air seemed colder, and the scent of lilies became overpowering. When they reached the destination, Daniel was shocked. It was an abandoned house, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked. "Yes," Miriam replied with a serene smile. She handed him a photograph of a young couple. "This is where we started our life together." She stepped out of the car and disappeared into the darkness. Confused, Daniel waited for a moment before deciding to leave. But when he looked at the photograph again, the people in it looked eerily familiar. One of them was Miriam, but the other man bore an uncanny resemblance to himself.